I'm very, very pleased to introduce Michael Thomas, who's going to talk about virtual worlds and social justice, an impact and civic engagement agenda. Michael Thomas is professor of education with a focus on digital learning, social justice. Oh my God, this is a word. Social justice, social mobility, and the student experience. He is a principal fellow of the HEA and holds 2 PhDs, one from the Newcastle University and a second one from Lancaster University. He has studied for an MBA in Educational Management at the University of Leicester, MEd at Manchester University, and an MA at Newcastle University, and Change Leadership at Cornell University. He has worked at 8 universities in Germany, Japan, and the UK, from ancient to Russell Group to modern, and led large multinational research groups and project teams. Without further ado, over to Michael. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, thank you, Heike. Thank you, everybody. I hope that you're all fit and healthy. Okay, I've got about 30 slides. I'm going to shoot through these in about 35 minutes. So as Heike said, I'm currently Professor of Education here in the UK. I've worked around the world, mainly in the area of digital education and learning, with a particular focus on computer-assisted language learning. Latterly, I've been more interested in developing critical perspectives on technology use around the culture of killer applications and technologies. But I also see, particularly in this particular moment, of course, opportunities presented by online learning in terms of social inclusivity, working with learners who are non-traditional, and in particular learners from areas of socioeconomic disadvantage. You can see a couple of my books on the screen there from one of my earlier series, which is about 10 or 12 years old now in digital learning. And as I reflect on this journey over the last 20 years, in fact, I just want to pause and reflect and explore some of the research issues that have emerged around learning technologies. To what extent is it still influenced by a rather narrow mindset in many ways, focused in on itself, still kind of obsessed with experimental studies, trying to prove if the use of digital applications and technologies is better than the non-digital world in many ways? That's still a preoccupation. I think what I try to do here over the next 20, 30 minutes is get you to reflect in this particular moment about how we need to be more outward looking, socially focused, historically aware, that is, historically aware of the journey over the last 20, 30, 40 years in learning technologies, and to be more civically engaged and critical in orientation. So this presentation offers you some reflections on where we are, asks you to consider, particularly at this moment where we had this global pandemic, a global crisis in public health, in which online learning has become so dominant. Over the course of a couple of weeks, almost everybody seems to be getting rid of their resistance to this form of technology, going online and using these technologies. I want you to reflect on what this is going to look like after. Hopefully there will be an after in terms of this current crisis. Is this an opportunity for real progressive change in terms of the role of online education and potentially platforms like virtual worlds? Or will it be a way to continue the current, what many people call neoliberalization of education, with more casualization, more marketization within the educational sphere, and now, perhaps interestingly, with much or many fewer barriers to actual change? Let me just change the slide. Okay, so that's my series on digital education and learning. We produced about 20 different titles. Like I say, what we've tried to do is to focus in on critical and historical perspectives, to think against the grain of normalization, to question some of the assumptions around digital technologies, and to think about technologies in a much more problematical rather than attempt to look at them in a normalized way. The idea, in fact, that learning technology should apply to all learners in all situations all of the time, and to call this into question. Some of the projects that I've been looking at recently over the last few years focus specifically on the potential of virtual worlds and virtual environments. For example, this one, the Camelot project, which looked at project-based learning and teaching using machinima to stimulate teacher creativity. And this one on the Guinevere project was a sister project which likewise looked at and tried to apply principles of game-based learning from the real world to virtual environments. In both cases, we were focused not really on the technology, but on the implications for teaching and learning. So the key findings in the case of both projects related specifically to the importance of teacher training. In this sense, not to procedural knowledge focused on any one particular technology, because it's a given. If we look at the history of technology, we see that they change frequently and often within this constantly shifting terrain. But to foreground, like I say, the importance of teacher training and the development of flexible teacher-educator mindsets, trying to think about teachers as someone who is capable of change, someone who's critical of the status quo, not merely a facilitator, but perhaps someone that we're trying to think about and reconceptualize as more of what we've called and what Stephen Banks called way back in 2011 as a difficultator. So we try to see how we can reposition educators, not as is often overwhelmingly the case within constructivism, which seems to be the dominant paradigm within online education, but to position educators, online educators, as difficultators. I really like this term. Those who are responsible for critique, for unsettling normalized assumptions, particularly about technology usage. Unsettling the assumptions around the way that digital is conceived, and it's become a very powerful discourse within neoliberal forms of education. What we try then to argue is that learning and teaching cannot be simply or easily measured in the context of what has become quite dominant, that is the customer satisfaction survey approach to education. But learning and teaching are based on the experience of being uncomfortable, of the feeling of not being at home, if you like, of not being comfortable, of being all at sea. And this is not easily quantified when learning and teaching are seen merely as a product to be consumed instantly in an educational institution that has become nothing more than a kind of job training center, rather than a place of questioning, a place of personal growth and development, and a place of critique. So difficultators then, I suggest to you, are not driven by the kind of inexorable speed of innovation and this powerful discourse around the digital innovation, but by a different temporality, by slow, unfashionable critique that needs careful reflection and deliberation. Trying to get you to think about this particular crisis, this kind of move, this kind of place that we happen to be in at the moment, and to think about to what extent this offers us an opportunity to reset the way we think about many issues that affect us in education. If it is it also a time of opportunities in which we need to think carefully about what brought us into this position and what comes next, and our role within that as educators? So in the UK at the moment, like in many countries around the world, we're in a state of lockdown with all non-essential trips or socializing outside the home against the law effectively. But does this current situation allow us to think again about the seemingly inevitable and normal way of life that we've all been accepting? the status quo of global travel, weekly commutes into work, what we take for granted in terms of our social relationships, all of these things seem suddenly to be under question. Thus, as educators, we also need to reflect on issues of sustainability, of social justice, of globalization, the importance of seeing and measuring value, not only through an economic lens, but also through other lenses concerned with individual and collective well-being, inclusivity, how we support people at the margins, and to reset, perhaps, and this is my question to you, what we mean by education in a time of neoliberal globalization. So key to my title was this concept, this term of social justice. It's heavily contested as a term. There's clearly no one single definition. It's in danger of becoming a new buzzword and in many ways losing all kinds of meaning. But it's clear from the research that it refers to some key principles, including equity, access, participation, and rights. But you need to think about how you operationalize these terms in your own particular context. So I'm asking you to reflect on what the term means for you, what it could mean for you in the context of your teaching, your practice, your research in educational technology, and in the narrower area of virtual worlds, rather than imposing my own kinds of ideas and definitions. So at the moment, we are seeing this phrase quite often around us. We have to maintain social distancing. I guess perhaps it's more a case of physical distancing, because we still want to socialize, and we can use technologies in order to do that. So the role of learning technologies such as virtual worlds may have a clear role to play in that, both within and across generations. What is interesting, I think, about this metaphor, social or physical distancing in relation to education, and to reflect on that, I think, as to what extent universities have often been accused of practicing social distancing, if you like, in their ivory towers over the last 100 or 200 years, in fact. That's the kind of vision we have of the university, of already being quite socially distant in some respects. But over the last few years, 5 to 10 years, we've also seen this push towards civic engagement within education. But this also tends to be measured through the lens of economics. And this, in fact, might be part of the problem. In 2019, I got together with a few other prominent educators, researchers in virtual worlds, and I put together a call for paper in the Journal of Virtual Worlds Research on impact. So in UK universities, academic researchers are measured every 6 or 7 years by a national exercise called the REF, or Research Excellence Framework. If you haven't got one where you happen to be, probably something like this is coming to you quite soon. But within this framework, our work is measured according to the excellence of outputs or publications, the research environment, and what is called impact, or the way that we engage as academics outside of the traditional ivory tower, the traditional walls of the university. And while this can be seen as part of a neoliberal agenda, it's also potentially a very powerful means of subverting it. So like I say, earlier in 2019, I put together this special edition. But while we aspire to challenge virtual world educators to bring together the kinds of civic engagement they've been doing over the last 1 or 2 decades, we're a little bit disappointed in that we didn't get a lot of research input in fields such as medicine or the military, all these kinds of areas where a tremendous amount of extra institutional, extra academic work and research is going on in dealing with disadvantage or the global south, special needs education, health, illness and well-being, for example. But most of the submissions were focused merely on, and still on, experimental studies comparing virtual worlds with non-virtual world education. This is not new, of course. And just look at those words on the screen there. We're talking about a seismic shift, an educational tsunami. We're not talking about the current moment, or perhaps we are, in relation to what's happened over the last 2 weeks, and that almost everybody, almost every institution seems now to be teaching online. what we are talking about, in fact, these phrases come from March 2012. And at that point, what emerged, hopefully you can see that, was the debate around MOOCs. Quite interesting. So this is why, as educational technologists, whether we're in virtual worlds or wherever we happen to be in terms of our engagement with learning technologies and educational technology, we need more of a sense of history. We see this quotation here from Thomas Friedman, talking out of that moment of MOOC hype and hysteria to in many respects. What we actually saw in relation to MOOCs was a tremendous amount of hype. And what the research actually told us later was that a lot of the people that MOOCs attempted to reach, in fact, given this gender of inclusivity, was actually wrong. What MOOCs did do is reach a lot of graduates, a lot of people who already had university education, and not the kinds of people who potentially it was trying to meet, those people who did not always traditionally engage with education. This is quite a sobering fact, given the recent research in the United States by Case and Deaton. Have a look at this. It's an interesting article in the Times Higher Educational Supplement this week, which talks about the recent research by Case and Deaton, which shows a strong correlation between the lack of four-year degree graduates and a significant rise in mortality rates among US white non-Hispanics aged 45 to 54, which has actually risen since 1999. So these people have been largely priced out of the marketplace of education, and they will see, as a consequence, significant health and wealth disadvantages as a result. So the motive behind MOOCs, according to some people, may have been more concerned with developing premium models of access to higher education content based on pay-per-view forms of study rather than free access and inclusivity. Most online instructors tend to be freelance within a heavily casualized industry. So indeed, even the pedagogy of MOOCs was not revolutionary, regardless of the hype. It was mostly based on transmission modes of instructivism. It's a famous quotation here from Diane Laurillard, an academic professor in the UK. And Laurillard reminds us that technology has been promising to revolutionize education for rather a long time. To be fair to technology, it is not technology itself, but it is perhaps the interests pushing technology, the people behind, if you want to call it big ed tech, who are actually pushing this vision of, which is a very evangelized, hype-driven discourse around the digital. As I say, this is the kind of thing that difficultators want to deconstruct, rethink about, reflect on, get underneath, reposition historically. This is not new, of course. Larry Cuban from Stanford in the early 1980s, in his book Oversold and Underused, took a very historical approach to learning technologies. So as he talked about, each of these highly touted electronic marvels went through a cycle of high expectations for reforming schools, rich promotional rhetoric, and new policies that encourage broad availability of the machines, yet resulted in limited classroom use. It's a well-known story, but we don't always appear to learn from history. What we do need to do is get underneath the surface of this, as I've said. And Neil Selwyn's work does a lot of this. As Selwyn suggests, we need, as difficultators, to dig deeper into the ideas and the discourse of digital education, which sustains this hype and hyperbole around online forms of education. As he writes, celebratory ideas of digital natives, which has become a really prominent kind of motif of digital education, can be used to obscure the economic and social differences in young people's lives and have been recruited as justification for political projects such as the marketization of education. In terms of futurists, and there are a lot of futurists around in digital education, we cast our minds back to Castronova, and I think it's 2007 that this book came out, when he talked about exodus to the virtual world. And it's quite interesting to think about that now in relation to what is happening. So my question again is, will the current moment of online learning lead to what Castronova has called an exodus to the online world, an exodus to the virtual world? What will it mean, like MOOCs, for pedagogy, for the role of teachers, for the role of civic engagement, and the normality or the new normality of online teaching and learning? Interesting quotation. I don't know if you can see that. I'll read it out. There appear to be, as Geordie Green suggests in an article this week, some glimmers of hope out there for some of us. Anyone even minimally involved in teaching or supporting learning has over the past week witnessed a quiet revolution in which instructors have turned to teaching centres and instructional design units, as well as to colleagues, professional organisations, social media and the internet search engines to learn together about a range of digital tools they will need to use to teach remotely, and about the design consequences of those choices. Teaching centre staff who have been shouting into the wind, I guess I'm one of them, about the benefits of learning communities can't help but smile as the entire collegiate instructional workforce scrambles to find the nearest hangout or Zoom teaching happy hour. So there has been this technology shift over the last few weeks, in many ways quite revolutionary. But albeit one in which learning technologies have been developed for other purposes and not necessarily based on good pedagogy. And that's an interesting slide showing the fact that often technology is used in quite traditional ways rather than leading to new forms of pedagogy. And this brings us right back to where we appear to be today. So a technological shift, access, going online hasn't necessarily been, in this particular moment, underpinned by a reliable pedagogical shift. My question is really around this. What are the implications of this now that a lot of the resistance has been taken away to going online? How will that shape what we mean by online education? And like I say, a lot of my work has been around deconstructing some of the hype around this and trying to ground it in the research. So if we look at EdTech, it's developed over the last few years into a significant academic and commercial industry. Estimations now suggest it's worth upwards of $6 billion worldwide, but it's not always based on the research. That takes too long often for the timescales of the marketplace and for the need for instant and continuous innovation and customer satisfaction. So indeed, research findings such as this meta-analysis from the use of ICTs in the school sector in the UK tell us quite clearly that technology-based interventions tend to produce slightly lower levels of improvement, in fact, when compared with other researched interventions and approaches. If we continue a little bit with this from Steve Higgins, he also suggests that it's not whether technology is used or not which makes the difference, which is a familiar refrain, but how well the technology is used to support teaching and learning. In fact, what the research does tell us quite clearly is that we need to focus in terms of effectiveness on clearer target groups, distinctive and specific groups, rather than some kind of general everyman. And in fact, by doing that, there's a kind of tyranny in the use of educational technologies within our learning environments by forcing everybody to use them. In fact, people learn in different ways, and we need to pay respect to different personalized routes within learning, which may include, in fact, the need to opt out of using digital altogether. So Higgins reminds us that remedial and tutorial use of technology can be particularly practical for lower attaining pupils, those with special educational needs, or those from disadvantaged backgrounds, in fact, in providing intensive support to enable them to catch up with their peers. So it's clear from looking at the research on learning environments, on virtual worlds, on simulations, on areas of this kind, that they can provide rich areas of learning in terms of motivation, authenticity, networking, opportunities for collaboration, and the development of digital literacy skill sets. The research suggests that using project-based learning, one of my areas of interest at the moment, cross-curricular project-based learning, can expand the range of resources available to learners, can improve task authenticity, can motivate students for task implementation, can promote agency and ownership. But we also need to be careful how this form of teaching and learning, which may fit very well with the kinds of constructivist environments we're quite used to, can also be reappropriated by discourses that would aim to turn real-world learning into mere preparation for employability, for employment. Yeah. So as not to see them as opportunities for a more holistic approach to education, which is my argument here. So we need to think carefully about how this current moment of online learning will lead to what kind of future. This is what I want you to kind of think about. Is it the case that it will make it easier, in fact, to promote types of fast food and instant learning that need to be endlessly innovative in place of slow, reflective, critically orientated learning that is more holistic and more integrated? There are, I think, some glimmers of hope. There's an interesting slide here from a recent article relating to some new types of algorithm for calculating university rankings. So we see some signs of some shifts in the way universities are now being ranked according to a more social justice and civic engagement agenda. And it's towards these kinds of alternative measures of excellence that I encourage you to move and to consider in the context of virtual world best practices. Yeah. So my question for you today is, in what ways has and can virtual worlds, within this turn towards online education, what can that do to help us reflect on and integrate this kind of agenda, in order to escape the focus on trying to prove endlessly, as we saw in my special edition of the Journal of Virtual Worlds Research, in fact, that just one technology is better than another or better than face-to-face education. So we can think about these bigger agendas around civic engagement in relation to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, for example, towards seeing education and how we measure and evaluate educator and educators, interestingly, not purely through these lenses focused on economics and quantitative measures of excellence, but in relation to how socially just we are, how we improve well-being for our students and our teachers, as well as the people who work within higher education and education in general around the world. So that would turn what we do within digital education environments, within even this area of virtual worlds, to think about research in relation to how we search for new solutions and knowledge related to sustainable development goals, how we think about ourselves as stewards who are responsible for their own consumption and sustainability, how we think about the outreach of the activities that we do, working directly with communities, regions, and nations, how we think about our teaching in terms of inculcating a sustainable mindset in our students and alumni, not just seeing them, I guess, as sources of income and external income. So I'd like to revisit this special edition, and I challenge you, you're listening to me today, virtual world educators, to think about the impact agenda, the civic engagement agenda in your activities within virtual worlds, and to see this moment of reset, to reflect on that, what this moment of this exodus, if you like, to the online world that is taking place quite rapidly, unprecedentedly over the last few weeks. What will that actually mean for online education going forward? Yeah. So my questions to end today. My questions to you then are, given this recent embrace of online learning, which has happened over the course of a very short period of time, how will virtual world educators change as a result? Will we revert, once this is over, to what we were doing before? Or in what ways will this change our practices? For some students, this might be their first experience of online education. Will it be so disappointing that in many ways it will end some of our opportunities to repurpose education in very positive ways? Or if it's seen as a success, what will that actually mean for online education? What will it mean for face-to-face education in the time beyond where we happen to be now? Hopefully there will be a moment beyond this current international global crisis. Will it, in your view, be changed by that experience? And in what ways for the future, in terms of this agenda of impact, socially just, civically engaged teaching, learning, and research? What forms of teaching, learning, and research will emerge from that? As I say, I've been trying to advance the case and the cause of online education for 2-3 decades, and met with tremendous resistance in some places. But given this movement, what will that actually mean for the way that we take forward education after this time? Okay, those were my questions to you today. Thank you for listening. Hope that got you thinking.
Thank you ever so much, Michael. It's been so provoking, to say the least, and we already had a really lively chat going on here in big clap. I think we can give you a clap on this one. Big round of applause. And we had some interesting discussions already on the live stream of the YouTube channel, and one feedback of your questions came in. That is, if Dr. Thomas wants an answer to what will happen now, let him know our school system is teaching with Zoom online as of last week. That was by Sidearm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you still hear me? Yeah, that's interesting. This week, last week, or maybe next week, or maybe for the next 6 months. But I'm thinking about how this event will actually impact beyond that over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Is it a dangerous moment in many ways? We've been waiting for this moment for a very long time. And people see many opportunities in it. But there are dangers as well as opportunities. And what I've tried to speculate on in many ways is that what we've seen is a form of remote teaching, isn't it? People are using Zoom, as you say, and Skype and all the rest of it, but it's actually a form of instructivism. It's not necessarily underpinned by effective forms of pedagogy. And that in itself casts our minds back to this moment of MOOCs and how that emerged as such a great moment of potential, but actually quite quickly was reappropriated into, even more traditional forms of teaching and learning, rather than producing the kinds of constructivist, collaborative teaching and learning environments that we thought it might do. Everything potentially is endlessly reappropriated, but in ways that we as educators do not necessarily agree with. And particularly in relation to teachers and privatization of education, the marketization of education, the casualization of education. These kinds of agendas run alongside online learning. And in many ways, we've taken away lots of the barriers to that over the last few weeks. So there are big questions about how we shape that agenda going forward. Yeah. What
also has been taken up by Lisa Durf, to extend that a little bit from the view of our learners, our students, to she's wondering if the current collegial collaborations will continue once the virus passes. Have you seen also major shifts amongst colleagues at the universities or even colleagues online sharing in this crisis? But what do you think? Will this pass? Michael?
That was my question for you guys.
It's been causing quite a lovely debate in the text chat about how this would shift and what they're thinking about it. Here it was Caroline who said earlier. Sorry, I'm moving away from the microphone really here by reading the chat. But that she's been thinking about this all the time, and mostly, and this is probably echoing a lot of what we have been feeling about this. How long have we been waiting for this opportunity to promote rich learning environments, virtual worlds, and our online way of teaching? Yeah. Now, finally, it is there. But the question is it the much awaited change and shift?
Yes, this is what I'm getting at. There was an interesting point there in the chat. It's just disappeared. Quite a long piece of text, I think. Technology is always double-edged, isn't it? It's always potentially liberating and inclusive. And on the other hand, you always have this potentially dark side as well. Somebody was just talking in the text about the fact how even though universities and educational institutions are operationalizing educational technologies here, one of the people there was suggesting that it was quite limited in many ways to the use of Microsoft Teams or particular applications. And therefore, it wasn't actually this moment of liberation, but was quite controlled in the way that we need to use certain applications and certain products. And we are not allowed this element of creativity beyond what the administration or the institution gives us and prescribes to us. Yeah, I think that was quite an interesting observation. It's Tizzy, I think it was, yeah? Is that right? Very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
There's always this double-edged nature of technology usage, isn't there? And this is precisely what I'm talking about with learning analytics, another thing. It's not always about the learning process within this wider context of the neoliberal educational system. It can, in a double-edged way, also lead to forms of surveillance and measurement and quantification of the educational experience. So this is what I'm getting at. I guess a lot of research on educational technology is quite blind. I think it's quite like an ostrich with its head stuck in the sand and not thinking often historically or critically about this, maybe not given the opportunity to, for precisely these kinds of reasons. And a lot of people have been talking about how we move towards this great moment of release when we fully understand the potential of online educational technologies. That is also a moment in which a lot of the resistance has been taken away. And what kind of online education system will we then see? How will it be reshaped? I'm repeating myself. I want to listen to some of the things you've said.
Well, can I bring to your attention also from the chat still a question or two, or maybe a question or two to the audience, because the discussion is really going wild now. Who's that? Alina asked, how do you suggest costly tech issues can be overcome to promote virtual worlds learning in our ailing world?
Be interested in people's answers to that. I did put up there Castranova's Exodus to the virtual world, didn't I? But in many ways, it's been a kind of exodus to Microsoft Teams, hasn't it? You still there? It's an exodus to Microsoft Teams, or an exodus to Skype, or an exodus to Zoom, and a very small and limited range of applications. But like I say, it's a kind of exodus to instructivism, isn't it? It's not been an exodus to, perhaps we have another time, to all the research that's been done over the years in terms of how we design more effective online environments. In relation to virtual worlds, you tell me, there's still barriers to entry. I mean, how many universities or schools have gone down the path of using Second Life or Open Simulator for online teaching in the last couple of weeks? Has there been a spike, or is there still a series of tremendous barriers to entry there in terms of those technologies?
Well, Max quite rightly asked, maybe the question for the in-worlders is, what can we do to encourage people to explore virtual worlds further?
Yeah. Dodge says we've had many professors coming into SL for the first time. Interesting.
But yeah, there's been a lot of new ones just for this conference, really.
According to Sue, virtual world technology is still not accessible in economic terms, thus definitely less inclusive. Even virtual worlds need a good enough hardware to be enjoyed and used properly.
Couldn't agree with her more. That's Sue's comment. Yeah, fantastic.
Sheila, interestingly, personally, I'm going to publicize my own virtual world engagement more. Oh, she's disappeared.
Yes, publicize my own virtual world engagement more, but I don't think it's the time to try and pressure homeschooling, caring, homeworking colleagues to gear up for virtual worlds. Or am I being defeatist? Great question, Sheila.
Yeah, olive tree, that's an interesting one. We don't really have the time to think about these deeper questions around pedagogical design and instructional design. I guess my question was, will we have the time even when we do have the time to think about that? Or will online end up, as some of the other people have suggested, being a very neatly packaged product? You get my point?
Mm-hmm. Well, Olive Tree asks, did anyone have a chance to look at better design? Most of the exodus is by people who've had no experience with online teaching or learning.
Yeah, I like that. I said that. Will we have the time when we do have the time? Presuming that in future we do have time. And that's another interesting thing. This moment represents a kind of hiatus, doesn't it, in terms of social relationships, employee-employer relationships. It's a kind of hiatus moment in which we presumably do have a bit more time to think about and reflect on these issues. And when we do get back to normality, presumably we will have less time to do that.
Dodge quite rightly says, I find that many educators initially try to apply the traditional education methods to an online technology. But those that stay learn to adapt their teaching to the new opportunities that are offered by the technology.
I was interested in your response to what I said about this need to think about the impact agenda around the kinds of activities you're doing in virtual worlds. Quite a lot of the research that has been productive has looked at, for example, the way virtual worlds can be very useful as meeting places across generations. Very interesting projects happening around the world, even now. Kindergarten kids or young primary school children in the UK now connecting with older people, their grandparents, for example, different generations, and using virtual worlds to meet across generations. These kinds of projects have tremendous impact in the sense in which I was designing it and trying to define it. Other research has looked at the use of virtual worlds in terms of learners with special needs or with autism, for example. in the medical field, virtual worlds being used for stroke victims, for example. There's a great project in the UK by City University called Ava Park, I think it is. And they created a space, I think it was in Second Life, an open simulator rather, aimed at victims of strokes who, for the first month, 2, 3, 4, 5 months after suffering a stroke, were not confident enough to leave their home in order to go to their hospice or their hospital to see their counsellor or their healthcare provider. This project used virtual worlds in order to provide a space for stroke victims who might have suffered from aphasia, which is problems in returning to use of speech, problems around speaking, in order to lower their anxiety and build up their confidence in a non-threatening environment. So there are lots of examples around that kind of area where virtual worlds are used to connect different groups together, different types of learners, particularly in relation to psychological aspects of their identity. And this is the kind of thing I was getting at in this special edition, and we were very hopeful for this because I think there's a tremendous amount of impact, these kinds of civic engagement activities, inclusivity, democracy, and so on, going around in relation to virtual worlds. So we're a little bit disappointed that we didn't get the research that shows how these activities are actually taking place. So I'd be interested in that and how we can maybe pivot towards that kind of agenda for virtual worlds. And what I'm trying to suggest, of course, is that the education system move away from, if you like, these neoliberal ideas of education purely for training, very instrumental ideas around education, to engage more with this social agenda. And interestingly, again, at this moment, this is what I see. People taking more opportunities to put away their mobile phones, potentially, and communicate with each other in different ways and collaborate with each other in different ways, in ways that are more socially responsible or socially engaged. So I'm trying to say, I think that there's a tremendous kind of impact agenda there. And as educators who work in virtual worlds, we need to celebrate that more and turn our research more towards the opportunities that kind of agenda presents. You see what I'm saying? Or is that too far?
No, fantastic input really into widening the scope of what education could be. And Rini Hathaway, she mentioned in the chat, there's also a hospital in the Midlands that works with people coming out of comas, some long-term comas as well. They use SL as a place to re-socialize the people who have come out of comas. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, and there's tremendous other projects going on, particularly in pediatrics, young kids going in to take different forms of treatment and using game-based environments or virtual environments to lower their anxiety and to explain the treatments in less kind of stressful ways. And we need to think as well about not just either, it's not just an either or, a face-to-face kind of learning environment future or an online future, but how we bring these environments together proactively to think more carefully about hybridized environments in the future and blended environments using the virtual and the face-to-face classroom. But I guess, I'm giving this presentation, I think there'll be a lot of American educators, I imagine. And I've tried to think about learning technologies like Neil Selwyn, like Larry Cuban, like Mark Warshauer, and all these people to think more critically and historically about educational technologies. I think that's what we need to do. But within this present context of what I see particularly in the US system, of privatized, marketized education system, increasingly pushing the humanities to the margins of that system. How can online education bring us back to this other alternative vision of what education can be, that is more socially responsible, based on more socially just agenda? Or, like I say, I don't want to keep repeating myself, will this moment help us to re-envisage a different type of education? Or will we not stop and pause, but continue with this? And this moment, this hiatus where a lot of people are seeing the opportunities of online, it will in fact be used to bolster more marketization, more casualization, more of a privatized education system focused on the instrumentalization of teaching and learning rather than the civic engagement agenda.
And one can add research as well, more research. Oh, Michael, thank you so much for widening our horizon to the endless possibilities of virtual worlds. It's been wonderful. And you've really encouraged everyone to express themselves in texture like mad. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in that fantastic discussion. We thank you, Michael, very much for this input. That will definitely be one that goes beyond virtual world best practice in education, which is still going on today and tomorrow. We cannot thank you enough. Yeah, big round of applause. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Heike.